In the quiet suburbs of Chicago, few people suspected that one of America's most notorious serial killers was hiding in plain sight. By day, John Wayne Gacy was a successful businessman and a well-known member of his community. He even entertained children while dressed as a clown, but behind the friendly smile was a dark secret that would shock the nation. As young men and boys began disappearing, investigators uncovered a horrifying trail that led straight to Gacy's doorstep. This is the disturbing story of John Wayne Gacy, the killer who became known as the Killer Clown. Gacy lived in Chicago in a township house, and when police searched his house, underneath it they found the remains of 26 young men and boys crammed into a small, shallow crawl space. Following his arrest on December 21st, 1978, a search of his property revealed a total of 29 bodies buried on his land, including three others found elsewhere on his property and several others scattered in nearby Des Plaines River. In all, Gacy was convicted of unaliving 33 people. Along with the people's remains, police found personal belongings of his victims, including a ring from a school student who went missing called John Shike. Gacy was a respected local contractor and used his own employees and his reputation as a friendly neighbor and children's party entertainer. He dressed up as a clown for children's parties. He used the facade to lure his victims, often forcing them to wear handcuffs, and pretended it was a magic trick. The discovery was driven by a strong odour that persisted in his house, especially when the furnace was on, which neighbours and visitors had noticed. Gacy's early life was defined by physical and emotional abuse from his alcoholic father, medical issues, and his sexuality. He was born on March 17, 1942, and grew up in Chicago, Illinois, in a household where he constantly failed to meet his father's approval and extremely high standards. His father regularly beat Gacy and his mother along with his sisters. His father constantly called him sissy, stupid, and a dummy, severely, severely damaging his self-esteem. Gacy spent his entire childhood trying to win his father's approval, but his father was never interested. At age 11, Gacy was hit in the head by a swing, which caused a blood clot in his head that went undiagnosed for years. The blood clot caused him to suffer regular severe blackouts and fainting spells throughout his teenage years. He was diagnosed with a congenital heart condition as a teenager, which made him miss a lot of school and couldn't play sport activities very often. Due to his frequent illnesses and his father's discouragement, Gacy struggled to meet new people and struggled to fit in, and spent most of his time by himself. Even though Gacy went through a lot of trauma caused by his father, it gave him no excuse to do what he did. Some of the crimes he committed, he put a lot of people, innocent people, and obviously the families, through a lot of pain and suffering. And it just goes to show you don't know what goes through someone's mind. You think people are completely normal, and most people are, but you don't really know who that person is. There's always a story behind everyone, and they do say look out for the quiet ones, don't they? So, but Gacy realised early on he was attracted to men, but he was deeply repressed those feelings due to his father's intense homophobia and the society's stigma of the 1940s and 1950s. Gacy wanted to get away from his abusive father, so began working various jobs at a very young age, including delivering newspapers and grocery shopping for neighbours. This early drive developed into a lifelong obsession with being seen as a busy, productive, and respectable member of the community. Gacy's first crime occurred on November 7th, 1968, and he pleaded guilty to it after he coerced a 15-year-old boy into SA, which is sexual assault. At the time, Gacy was a respectable married man who he met, and her name was Marilyn Myers, and he married her in 1964, and the marriage lasted only until 1969. They had 2 children together, a son called Michael and a daughter called Christine. The assault on the boy happened in 1967, and Gacy piled the boy with alcohol. After the boy told his father and the police that when they got involved, Gacy then paid another teenager $300 to beat and intimidate the 15-year-old so he wouldn't testify in court. Following his arrest for the assault and the intimidation, Gacy was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. Doctors diagnosed him with an antisocial personality disorder. He blamed others for his problems, but they deemed him mentally stable to stand trial. Gacy was then sentenced to 10 years in prison for the crime, but following his arrest and conviction, his wife then set up divorce proceedings, and it was finalised in 1961, and he was refused access to his children. While he was in prison, he manipulated the system of the prison. He became a model inmate, so he was given early parole. The parole board released him after only 18 months of a 10-year sentence, so it just goes to show, even back then, the prison sentence, the justice system, wasn't too good. For a crime like that to only be given 18 months of a 10-year sentence is pretty much a joke, really. And if he was given longer, maybe some of his crimes never happened. But I feel so sorry for the families, the boy who was affected by his crimes. But it just goes to show, he come across really nice, really respectable, and people never saw the dark side to him. When he was released from prison, he moved to Chicago to live with his mother. Gacy then remarried a woman called Carol Hoff in 1972, but she divorced him 4 years later, in 1976, after finding pornography and becoming suspicious of his behaviour. While on parole from prison, Gacy was arrested twice for sexual assault in Chicago, but the charges were dropped. When the victims never turned up to court, Gacy then became a manager and a part owner of a company called PMD Contractors, a business that tended to employ young men. He became a well-known and popular figure of the community and was involved in politics and started to perform at his parties and hospitals dressed as a clown called Pogo. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy started to lure young men to his home, promising them construction work, or at times he pretended he was a police officer. He would then handcuff them, telling them he was going to do a magic trick, and he would then sexually assault and unalive them. Dozens of young men and boys then started going missing, and many of them were discovered to be victims of Gacy. His victims tended to be people between the ages of 14 and 22, and many of them were hitchhikers, runaways, or even young men looking for a job at Gacy's construction company. Gacy frequently hunted for victims around the Greyhound bus station in Chicago, Bughouse Square, and the intersection of Clark Street, Diversey Parkway. Many young men that went missing were never formally reported to the police. Some families were estranged or believed their sons had simply moved away to start new lives, totally oblivious that they crossed paths with Gacy. When Gacy's property was evacuated in 1978, 33 bodies were recovered, but 8 remained totally unidentified and were buried under John Doe grave markers. Police originally struggled to connect the cases because a lot of the victims were just runaways, so they didn't take them as seriously and never thought they were crime victims because of that reason. Could you imagine back in those days, families wondering where their loved ones were, wondering where their kids were, and not realising that they actually weren't around anymore because of Gacy, because it wasn't taken seriously, because their family just thought they'd run away. That must have been awful, what going through their families' minds. Most of Gacy's victims were either young, gay or bisexual men and boys, and there was a stigma back then about it, so police gave little priority to them. The police just assumed they just cut ties with their family. When families decided to report their sons missing, police didn't take it seriously and told them that their son must have just run away looking for work, delaying critical early investigations. Back in those days, the computer systems wasn't as good and lacked that modern feel to it, so people just slipped through the system more easily. Because Gacy was well known in the area and well acquainted with politicians and a children's party entertainer, police didn't want to question him. They couldn't believe someone who was a pillar of the community would be a monster and commit such horrific crimes, but the truth is, Gacy was hiding in plain sight. In July 1975, John Butkovich went missing after a violent argument with Gacy over unpaid wages. Butkovich's father told the Washington Post that they begged Chicago police to investigate Gacy, but the police never even questioned him. Gacy was arrested and investigated multiple times for sexual assault during his killing spree. In March 1978, Jeremy Ridnell was abducted, given chloroform, and brutally raped him. After surviving, Ridnell went straight to the police, but they dismissed the assault as consensual encounter gone wrong, letting Gacy go with a minor battery charge and failing to search his home. This pattern was only broken in December 1978 when 15-year-old Robert Peast disappeared. Peast was a popular high school athlete and a highly persistent middle-class family who he was from, and the police launched an aggressive 24-hour surveillance operation. The police went to interview Gacy at his home, and he claimed he had spoken to Peast but didn't know of his whereabouts. The investigators then ran a background check, and they then realised he had a sexual assault offence already, and they realised they were dealing with a convicted sex offender. The police set up a 24-hour surveillance team to follow him, and over the next week, Gacy engaged in a psychological game with the officers. He invited them into his home for coffee, drove erratically to try and shake them off. On 13th of December 1978, police had a search warrant and turned up at his house. Police thought Gacy was deceiving them, so searched his home while he was in custody. They didn't find Peast, but they found highly suspicious items, including a ring belonging to John Shike and a photo of a pharmacy where Peast worked. Officers noticed how his house smelt of a foul odour, and Gacy dismissed it as a sewage backup problem. As the surveillance on Gacy tightened, his lawyer advised him he's going to eventually get arrested. Gacy's mental state then started to collapse, and he began using drugs and alcohol. On the 20th of December Gacy confessed to his defense attorneys that he had unalived over 30 people and buried them underneath his house. Early on, in December 21st, Gacy was officially arrested for possession of controlled substances, and knowing the game was up, he gave a formal confession to investigators, admitting he had unalived dozens of young men, handcuffed them, saying he was going to do a magic trick, and strangled them and concealed them in the crawl space in his house. Once he was in custody, police returned to his house with a second search warrant, and they started digging the crawl space and found loads of human remains. Over the next 26 weeks, workers carefully excavated 26 bodies from the crawl space and 3 others from other areas of the property. Gacy admitted that when the crawl space became full in 1977, he began driving bodies to 155 bridge and started throwing bodies in the Des Plaines River. Robert Peast was one of the 4 river victims, and his body was finally found in April 1977, or 1979, I mean. Gacy was kept under heavy guard at the Cook County Jail until his trial began in February 1980, where his insanity defense was quickly rejected by the jury. He was tried for 33 counts of murder, and at the time, it was the largest mass murder trial in United States history. The prosecution gave evidence of premeditation and calculation. They showed that Gacy used handcuffs for the crimes, kept a logbook of his victims' personal effects, and carefully prepared the graves in the crawl space ahead of time. On March 12, 1980, after more than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Gacy guilty on 33 counts of murder. On the 13th of March 1980, Gacy was sentenced to death for 12 of the unalivings and given consecutive life sentences of the remaining 21. Gacy was sentenced to death row unit at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. Over the next 14 years, he filed for numerous appeals, and all of them were denied. Gacy never expressed remorse the whole time he was in custody. On 10th of May 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Statesville Correctional Center. So that comes to the end of that story, that crime of John Wayne Gacy. He spent years hiding behind a mask of normalcy, but the real story isn't about the man who committed these crimes. It's about the young lives that were stolen and the families who were left searching for answers. Gacy's case remains one of the most disturbing serial murder investigations in American history, with more than 30 victims identified and some questions still debated decades later. If there's one lesson to take from this case, it's that evil doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it hides behind a smile, a reputation, or a position of trust. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, consider liking and subscribing for more deep dives into true crime, history, and criminal investigations. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.